Hello, I'm chatting today with David F. Berens, or Dave as we call him. How you doing, Dave?
I'm pretty good, Jim. How you doing today?
Not too bad, not too bad. Let me tell our audience a little bit about you. David Berens has traveled up and down the East Coast and has been a tourist at every beach from Key West to Pawleys Island. Today he calls Knoxville, Tennessee home, but constantly dreams of sun and sand and ocean breezes. He has a beautiful wife, a rambunctious little girl, and a happy little boy who remind him daily of why he is alive. A constant reader of Florida fiction, Dave has enjoyed the likes of Carl Hyacin, Tim Dorsey, Randy Wayne White, Lawrence Shames, and Leonard Elmore, just to name a few. So when he decided to create a series of island thrillers, he did his best to capture that zany quality so many of these amazing writers use in their work. Someday, he hopes he'll be able to enjoy writing his books with a view of the ocean. Be sure to check out David F. Berens for more information and to join his reader group. So, Dave, I can't help but notice the one thing you didn't note here in your Amazon bio is how you relentlessly update your book covers once a week.
It is true. It is true. Yeah, you're always looking for the one thing to make them sell a little bit better, and that's it's one of those things I like doing. So I update them constantly.
Yeah.
So I think they're pretty well set now. I don't think they're going anywhere.
Well, I think your Troy Bodine covers look pretty good. I know you've
Thank you.
tweaked those quite a bit, and they look nice. They look quite foreboding and intense.
Thank you very much.
So tell us a little bit about you and your writing, maybe and what's not in your Amazon bio.
Well, the Troy Bodine series is kind of the flagship series. I write those approximately maybe 3 times a year. I put out a new book maybe 3 times a year, and each one of those was almost unplanned. I wrote the first one without much thought about turning it into a series, but it sold and it did well, and I had a lot of people asking when part two was coming out. So I threw a story together and came up with another story after that, and they've just kind of rolled right along. So it's been a good thing. It's been a really nice surprise.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking today about your favorite thriller, and the book that you wanted to talk about was Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King.
That's right.
Can you give us like a little spoiler-free synopsis or a teaser? Just tell us what the book's about.
Yeah, it's Stephen King's sort of foray into what you might call a police procedural. It does kind of follow the detective, and then on the flip side of that, it follows the sort of the bad guy, if you will, and you get to see the viewpoint of the detective as he's investigating the case, and then you also get to see the viewpoint of the criminal, the perp, as they call it, and so it's really cool because you actually get to get inside the mind of that killer and see why he's doing these things, and so without revealing too much, you of course find out that the detective is trailing this guy as he's planning the next big I don't know what to call it, massacre. So at the very, very beginning of the book, this guy comes out of the fog and kills a lot of people driving a Mercedes into a line where people are waiting to go to a job fair. That crime sort of kicks things off, and then we see the development of this character into his next planned killing, I guess. So it's very intense. It does, I guess, maybe cross the line into. I don't guess it really gets into horror too much, but as is Stephen King is famous for, it does send some chills up and down your spine.
Yeah, I think I've read that one, and I don't think it has any supernatural
Right.
elements to it, but I think it's kind of one of those Stephen King books where he sort of might imply that there could be something supernatural going on
Right.
in the background. Stephen King is
Yeah.
one of those rare writers who he can write a book that kind of touches on 5 or 6 different genres at once.
Right.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
and yeah, thriller is something that's relatively uncommon for him.
Hmm.
A straight thriller with no vampires or werewolves in it.
Right.
But I think this book qualifies. You could call it a thriller or a police procedural because
Right.
it does follow a lot of those tropes, I think.
Yeah. Exactly.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that Stephen King is known for is developing. I think one of the reasons he's had such longevity is the way he's able to develop characters that are very relatable and feel very human. Do you think that Mr. Mercedes is more character-based, or is it more plot-based?
I definitely think it's character-based. You're immediately immersed into the world of the detective. He's retired and, possibly not the happiest he's ever been. He's sort of in the place where he is alone and doesn't have anything to do anymore because he's now retired. And so there's even the suggestion that he's dealing with suicidal thoughts, depression, and things like that. And on the flip side of that, the interesting part about that is so is the criminal mind, the guy that's perpetrating all this, Mr. Mercedes. He is also struggling with these issues. And when you boil it down, it's a cop chasing a bad guy. So the plot is a fairly common one, but because you got such incredible character development with these two guys, especially, you really do relate. It's one of those things where if you can take a character that's a retired detective that I have absolutely nothing in common with and make me feel for him and want to see him succeed, and then on the other side of that, understand, if you can say this, understand why this Mr. Mercedes guy is committing these atrocities, that's really incredible. Stephen King's always been really, really good at that, taking a character that maybe you don't relate to and making him very relatable.
Mm-hmm. I remember I saw Stephen King give a speech somewhere. It was on a YouTube video, and he was writing Mr. Mercedes at the time, and so he talked a lot about that. And I think, if I remember this right, he said that initially he was writing it as a short story, because from what I remember near the beginning of the book, after Mr. Mercedes drives the car and kills all those people, then we switch to the cop. Was his name Bill?
Yeah,
Bob?
Bill.
Where Bill gets it has something to do with Mr. Mercedes sent him a letter taunting him or something like that he would never be able to figure it out, and that the short story ended with Bill putting the gun in his mouth and killing himself.
Oh my gosh.
But as Stephen King was writing it, he decided he liked this Bill character too much to kill him off after 30 pages, and so he wanted to actually see where it would go. Yeah,
that's hard to imagine. That scene happens, in the book, the detective is sitting at home, and he actually has the gun on the bedside table or on the just the side table, and his thoughts are, definitely dark. He's definitely in that place, and something about the way the Mr. Mercedes character taunts him brings him back to life. He really wants to get this guy. And the irony is that Mr. Mercedes is really trying to push Bill over the edge and make him commit the suicide. But in turn, it makes him give it up. He puts the gun away and starts on the crime and starts on the case, and gives him a reason to be, gives him a reason to live. So it's really in depth. It's really cool.
So you were talking about how, that Bill was having some suicidal thoughts, and Mr. Mercedes was as well. So it kind of sounds like you were describing that they're, in a way, sort of mirrors of each other. And that's part of what makes him a compelling villain.
That's right. Yeah, if he's just a super bad guy, you kind of don't really care. You don't really care if the guy gets killed or murdered, and he's a bad guy, but it's one of those where if you don't really understand where he's coming from, he becomes very two-dimensional. And I think when you give the guy, okay, he's murdered a lot of people, but his redeeming qualities by following him, in his world, you understand at least what his warped motivation is. And I think that makes him a real character, not just sort of a caricature.
So do you think to have a great thriller that the hero is more important or the villain?
Ooh, boy, that's a good question. I think a good thriller actually blurs those lines sometimes. A thriller that is really well done shows you that the villain has reasons. It's one of those things where you don't pull for the villain, you don't root for the villain, but you get it in a weird sort of way. You kind of understand. If he's just a bad guy and just going around killing people, you're like, oh, I want him to get what's coming to him. And, ultimately you do. But it's interesting because I think you're right, and you touched on it. These guys are flip sides of a coin that don't have anything to do with each other.
Mm-hmm.
They are the heads and tails, but they're related in a lot more ways than maybe Bill Hodges wants to admit.
Yeah, sometimes you see in a thriller that and I don't think this applies to Mr. Mercedes, but in some thrillers, the hero and the villain both want the same thing for different reasons. Right.
Yeah, it's one of those tricky lines to travel along. You don't want to make the bad guy too bad. I mean, you want him to be evil in a way, and you don't want the good guy to be too good. You don't want this vanilla sort of black and white, because honestly, that's rare in the actual real world. So why would you get that in a thriller?
Yeah. So would you describe Mr. Mercedes as a page turner?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think you get to the end of each scene or each chapter, and you almost have to turn the page to see what is getting ready to happen, what's going to happen next. And Stephen King does a great. He has a technique it's almost meta in a way, because he will talk about something that has not happened yet. For instance, in the very beginning, and there's no spoiler here, but there's a guy standing in the line when the Mercedes is going to plow them down, and he makes a comment. Stephen King makes a comment about the guy's left arm that will soon be torn from his body. It's a really sort of odd meta moment, because it hasn't happened yet, and you as the reader are sort of like, oh wait, what happened? What did he said somebody's going to lose their arm? So you almost have to turn the page and figure out where that's, what's going to happen, what's going to tear this guy's arm off. So he gets away with it where a lot of writers couldn't. Really.
Stephen King has an uncanny ability to just create the most tense suspense, I think, and to delay it and to prolong it. Like, I remember after the movie, I read that book It, which is definitely not a thriller, but it has a lot of thrilling moments in it. I read it in high school, and it terrified me. And then after the movie came out, I read the book again. Yeah. And there's a scene early on. Well, I say early on, but it's probably about 200 pages into the book, where how can I say this without spoiling anything? Where a character is at home with his wife, and he's extremely upset, and he goes in the bathroom and locks the door. And then the following scene is from his wife's point of view, and she's outside the door, and she's trying to call out to her husband. She's, saying, "Are you okay? What's going on in there? I'm worried about you." And in the scene, you just want to find out what's going on in that bathroom. Is he okay? And Stephen King spends like 15 pages before you actually get to open the door. Yeah, and it's maddening. It's like 15 pages of this deep, intense suspense before you get to find out if the guy's okay on the other side of the door.
Yeah, exactly.
That's, I think, part of the reason why why everything he puts out becomes a #1 bestseller, because he's just pulls you into the story and makes you on the edge of your seat, worried about what's going to happen.
Yeah, he definitely has the talent of making, the inciting incident of the Mr. Mercedes novel is, the guy driving the car into these people and murdering a lot of people. And he spends, like you said, 15, 20 pages talking about the people in line. And, dropping little hints like, the arm that he would lose here in a couple of minutes. And you get through this in-depth opening scene just to see them plowed over and never come back. And, it's again, one of those things you're on the edge of your seat, and you get to the end of it and you realize, oh my gosh, all those people are now no longer in this book. They're gone. So it's like you said, Stephen King has a talent for that for sure.
So Mr. Mercedes was a series, or was it he wrote some more books after this featuring that character, right?
Right. There are three in the series. And I can't remember what the second one and third one are called, but I think he ends the first one with closure, but then I don't want to give anything away, but it definitely opens up for the next one. There's definitely I guess you'd call it a mild cliffhanger. The story sort of ends, but he leads you into the next one. So, and it's expertly done. It's not sort of one of those where you're mad because he left it open.
As a reader, Dave, how do you feel about cliffhangers?
I like them. I don't mind them at all. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Netflix shows are so popular. and series shows, Amazon Prime and those things, because a lot of times the episode ends and you are dying to see what happens next. So what do? You play the next one, and it's a similar device, even from chapter to chapter, and I don't mind it, especially if I'm really enjoying it and I got to the end and I want more. Then boom, I'm gonna buy the next one. So I don't think it's. Some people don't like it, and I get it, I understand, but if the story's that good and you get to the end and you're like, oh no, get the next one, see what happens next.
I read a piece of advice one time about Netflix series that if there's a series that it always every episode ends on a cliffhanger and you can't take it, that the thing to do is to stop the episode, to pause it about 10 minutes before the end.
Right.
Because by that point they'll have usually wrapped up the episode arc, but then you don't get into that territory of the thing that's going to make you, like if you have somewhere to be,
right? Yeah.
Stop it about 10 minutes before it's over, and then just come back and watch that later when you have time to. Anyway,
to roll into the next one. Yeah, no, I know exactly. My wife and I have had this exact conversation because we always know when the cliffhanger is coming. Oh, here it comes. 10, 15 minutes in till the end, and you're going to get the new scene that draws you in. So.
Yeah. So I know when we were discussing what book you were going to talk about, you gave me a few options, but we settled on talking about Mr. Mercedes. What is the one thing you think that makes Mr. Mercedes stand above other thrillers that you might want to have talked about?
Well, to be honest with you, I have tried a lot of different thriller authors. And naturally, I bounce between genres. I do a lot of action adventure reading, and I do, I write tropical thrillers or sea-based thrillers, Florida fiction, that kind of thing. So I read quite a few of those authors, and I actually have tried to read some sort of straight-up thrillers that just didn't hold me. And I think it comes back to what we said before, the characters. I just didn't care. I just didn't really mind that the bad guy was bad or the good guy was good. And I think Mr. Mercedes and Stephen King, as a writer in general, does a really good job of making me really care. I want to know what's happening. Why is this guy sitting with a gun on his side table and considering, taking his life? Why did this guy pick a Mercedes, and why is he running into people that are, in a job fair in line? And it's a lot deeper than even my description there, but I think that's what makes it stand above. I have to know. I've read it before, and I went back to sort of just refresh my memory before our interview, and I was like, I still want to know. I'm still trying to get to the end of it to see what happens, and that's a pretty good sign. They can keep your attention even when you know the story and know what's going to happen. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I completely agree with your take on thrillers. There's some that I tried to read, even some very, very popular thrillers that I couldn't get into because I didn't find a reason to care about what the hero was doing early on in the book. So have you have you read everything by Stephen King, or do you pick and choose? Do you like, because he crosses so many genres.
Yeah.
Do you look to see like what it's about, or are you a big Stephen King fanatic?
I'm kind of a fanatic. When it comes out, I pretty much get it now. In the beginning, I didn't. And I'll be honest, I haven't read many of the early ones. I haven't read Christine. I have not read Carrie. I haven't read Pet Sematary, though I've seen the movies for all of these. I did read It. And probably the first one that made me really gravitate to him was Hearts in Atlantis. And that's not even a really big hit of his. But since then, I've pretty much gotten everything, even to The Stand and The Dark Tower and things like that cross into some fantasy elements. And, so I've gotten to where now I trust that he's going to give me a good story and I pick it up.
So I'll tell you, read Carrie, read Pet Sematary. You can skip Christine.
Okay, gotcha.
Christine's not that. It was okay, but it's not that great. But in general, I think his early stuff is a lot of his best.
Really?
Yeah, Carrie was great. The Shining, Salem's Lot.
And I read The Shining, and then I read Dr. Sleep after, which is the sort of the sequel that happened. I don't know how many 20 years later or whatever, but enjoyed those a lot. So I'll take your advice.
So Here's a kind of a general question about thrillers. What do you think makes a thriller a thriller?
That's a good question. Because as well as I do, I gave you, several choices, and I was like, well, is that really a thriller? Does that really hit the tropes? Does that hit the things that make me think that this belongs in a thriller genre category, or is it just a suspense? And so that's where I get a little bit, mixed up, where it could be a suspense novel, it could be a thriller novel, but I think thrillers boil down to the villain, the bad guy, giving you a chill, sort of a like, ooh, this is very creepy. What if this really happened? I had a similar moment in my own life when I took my wife, daughter, and son to the zoo. Here recently, we wanted to go to the zoo. We took them, we were walking around, and they had to go to the bathroom. Somebody had to go to the bathroom. So my wife and daughter maybe stayed outside, and I walked into the bathroom and walked out, and they had moved on, and I couldn't find them. And so the instant, problem is your mind says all of the, tells you all of the worst possible things that could have happened. And, in my mind, a writer's mind, I'm thinking, oh, that's a great beginning to a story. You walk out, something really bad has happened that sends chills up and down your spine. I don't mean it to sound like it probably is going to sound, but if you see a shooting or you see something like that, or you see a crime happen, that doesn't have thrills in the same way that walking out of the bathroom and your people being gone has. I write more crime fiction that has a murder or, a bad event that kicks off everything. But a thriller, I think, has to make you afraid of that thing happening in your own life. I think that's one of the interesting ways of looking at it. If that happened to me, I would be terrified.
So that's an interesting take on it. So for you, a thriller has more to do with the sense of dread that the villain produces throughout the story.
I think so. Yeah, I think when you start talking about a real true thriller, and you see this a lot now that people are sort of dipping into psychological thrillers, The Girl on the Train and these kinds of movies and books where there's a relatable sense of fear. There's a scene where you've been there, you've been in that scene, and there's something inside of you that clicks and gets afraid. Mm-hmm. And I think that for me is kind of where I feel like it goes into thriller category. Mm-hmm. If I can feel that to me says it's a thriller.
Okay. So now that we have thoroughly talked through Mr. Mercedes, Dave, what book of yours would you like to talk about?
I wrote Rogue Wave, which is the first book in the Troy Bowden series, as a connection of characters. There's a string of characters all after the same thing. And to me, it was more fun to tell who the people were, because it's pretty obvious why they were going after the thing. In this case, it's a hat. And it's more about how each character relates to the hat and how each character chases the hat. Trying not to spoil my own book. But, it's kind of one of those things where I liked examining who the characters were, why they were there, why they were after it, and showing in my case, some fun stuff and some zany stuff. So Rogue Wave, the first book, definitely one of my favorites for that reason.
So I'm looking for it here. Right. The tagline, what would you do if you found a hat with a $7 million check inside? What if it came off a dead man's head? That's a great hook.
It's not too bad. I've worked on that, just like the covers. I've tried to mess around with it and get it to tell you what's going on without spoiling it. That's the real trick. If you can get a hook that grabs you without revealing the secret or the big thing that's going to happen, and I think you got something there.
Well, that's a pretty compelling beginning, because I think when you ask what would you do, that's because Troy Bowden sounds like just kind of a regular guy who's thrust into an extraordinary circumstance, and you find a hat that's got a whole bunch of money inside it, and you find out that it's related to a dead man. I think that's a pretty interesting hook. That's
I hope so. Yeah, I like it.
nice.
Thanks, man.
Well, Dave, is there anything else you want to let the audience know before we go?
I don't think so. I would definitely, if you're into thrillers, pick up Mr. Mercedes. You can read the first one and not necessarily have to move on to the second and third, but I think you probably will. I think when you get to the end, it leaves you with a hook, and I think that's the reason it's such a great thriller.
And I think everybody should pick up Rogue Wave, a Troy Bodine tropical thriller, book 1, and there's 6 books in the series now.
6 books in this series, another one on the way, so we're rolling right along.
The spin-off series coming soon.
Yeah, Troy has a brother. A lot of people didn't know that, but he appears in the second book, and it is a slightly different take. It's more action adventure, and it sort of gets into the realm of a Clive Cussler book. So it's got some crossings of the Atlantic Ocean and some dives and some salvage and cool stuff like that. So I'm currently working on that, and I don't want to give away too much about it because we're going to be doing the whole series and releasing them pretty much back to back, and that should happen mid to late summer.
Okay, great.
Very cool.
Well, Dave, thanks for stopping by today and chatting with us about your book and about Mr. Mercedes.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it.